The diner sat on the edge of an empty highway, a lonely relic from the 50s with its neon sign flickering on and off like it was gasping for breath. Despite its worn-down appearance, Maggie's Diner had loyal patrons, mostly truckers and the odd traveler looking for a warm meal in the middle of nowhere. They'd slide into the red leather booths, order a coffee, and chat with Maggie, who had owned the place since anyone could remember. One winter night, a heavy snowstorm descended on the town, cloaking everything in white and muffling the sounds of the few passing cars. Maggie wasn't expecting anyone to come in that night, so she had sent her cook and busboy home. It was just her and the warm buzz of the old jukebox in the corner, playing Elvis tunes that skipped and crackled every now and then. Just as she was about to lock up, a figure appeared out of the swirling snow. He was tall and thin, wrapped in a long, tattered coat with snow sticking to his shoulders. He pushed through the door, and a blast of icy wind followed him, making Maggie shiver despite the warmth of the diner. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but his eyes glinted under his hat as he slid into the booth at the far end, where the light was dimmest. Maggie approached him cautiously, her usual smile faltering. "Coffee?" she asked, voice shaking slightly. The man didn't answer, just nodded, and she scurried back to the counter, heart pounding. Something about him set her teeth on edge. She had been around strange folk before, truckers with wild stories, drifters with dark eyes. But this man was different. She brought him his coffee and watched as he lifted it to his lips, his face still mostly obscured. For a moment, she thought she caught a glimpse of a scar running from the corner of his mouth up to his temple, a deep, jagged line that looked as though it had been hastily stitched together. But when she blinked, it was gone, and she thought maybe she was just seeing things in the dim light. As she turned to leave, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like someone who hadn't used it in a long time. "Ever heard of the Midnight Diner?" Maggie frowned. "Can't say I have." The man leaned back, staring at her intently. "It's an urban legend, they say. A diner that appears at the stroke of midnight, somewhere off a forgotten road, out in the middle of nowhere. You sit down, order a meal, but once you're inside, you can never leave." A shiver ran down Maggie's spine, but she forced a laugh. "Sounds like a good ghost story." The man didn't laugh. "Not a story. I was there." Maggie felt her smile fade. She could see now that his hands clutching the coffee cup were covered in faint scars, as though he'd clawed his way out of something. The man leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was just another place off the road, like this one," he said, his eyes flickering around the diner. "I was on a long haul, needed a rest, and there it was. No cars in the lot, no sounds except the hum of an old fridge in the back. I walked in, sat down, and waited." He took a sip of coffee, staring into the dark liquid as though it held the memories. "The waitress, she wasn't like you. She was pale, skin as white as bone, and her eyes were blank, just big, empty eyes like two pits. When she spoke, it was like she was trying to remember how." Maggie felt herself shivering, but she was rooted to the spot. She'd heard plenty of strange stories, but there's something about the man's voice, his stare, that made her believe every word. "I ordered a sandwich," he continued, his voice growing softer. "But when it came, it wasn't right. It was cold, the bread hard, like it had been left out for days. And the meat, it was..." He trailed off, shuddering. "I took one bite, and I tasted blood." Maggie took a step back, horrified, but the man's gaze held her. "I looked around, and that's when I noticed them, the other customers." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They were all watching me, eyes blank, faces pale. They were wrong. Their hands were twisted like claws, and their faces had these horrible smiles that didn't reach their eyes." He let out a ragged breath, the coffee cup shaking in his hand. "I tried to leave, but every door I went to, it led back inside. I ran through the kitchen, past the storage room, even the restroom, but it was like the whole diner was folding in on itself. Every hallway twisted back to that booth, back to them, just staring." The man's face was pale now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "I ran until I was out of breath, until I thought I'd go insane. And then, finally, I saw an open window. I didn't think, I just jumped. Hit the pavement so hard I thought I broke my leg." He looked up at her, eyes wide with fear. "When I looked back, the diner was gone. Just an empty stretch of road, no lights, no sign, just nothing." The jukebox crackled, making Maggie jump. She hadn't realized how quiet the diner had become. The familiar hum of the refrigerator and distant sounds of the road swallowed up in the man's story. "You don't believe me," he said, his voice hollow. "But I swear, it was real. It's out there, waiting for people like me. Like you. Maggie swallowed, throat dry, and forced a smile. Well, you made it out, didn't you? The man stared at her, his face unreadable. He looked down at his coffee, swirling the dark liquid before speaking again. You never really escape. Once you've been to the midnight diner, it follows you. He looked around her diner as if inspecting it, then whispered, Sometimes it finds new places. Maggie's eyes widened as she glanced around. The diner felt different, darker somehow, as if the shadows had grown deeper. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed closer, as though they were inching toward her. When she turned back, the man was gone. She hadn't heard the door open, hadn't seen him stand, but his booth was empty, save for the untouched cup of coffee. Her heart pounded as she hurried to lock the door. Outside, the snow was falling heavier, muffling all sound. She took a deep breath, glancing back to where the man had sat, hoping it had all been some strange nightmare. But then she noticed something. A small smudge on the counter, dark red like dried blood. It trailed along the counter, leading toward the back of the diner, the kitchen. Maggie froze. She could feel something in the air, something watching her. Her mind raced with the man's story, with visions of pale faces and blank stares. And as she turned back to the empty booth, she felt a cold chill, a sense of something lurking just beyond her sight. Outside, the neon sign flickered, and for a brief moment, the word Maggie's dimmed, replaced by something else. Midnight Diner. The Last Stop Diner had a reputation among the locals. It was the kind of place you'd stop only if you were desperate. A cracked linoleum floor, harsh fluorescent lights, and a strange, sour smell that seemed to cling to the walls. The owner, Dale, was an old man with a haggard face and a quiet demeanor. He never spoke much, especially about why his diner stayed open all night, even though hardly anyone came by. But one cold October night, as the rain poured down and washed over the empty streets, a young couple stumbled through the door, soaked and shivering. Lucy and Jack were on a cross-country road trip, though they'd taken a wrong turn somewhere in the hills and lost their way. The highway had vanished, replaced by winding dirt roads, and for hours they'd seen no signs, no buildings, just miles and miles of dark trees pressing in on all sides. The diner's neon sign had blinked in the distance like a beacon, calling them to warmth and safety. But as they entered, both of them felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Dale greeted them with a nod and slid 2 menus their way without a word. His eyes were hollow, dark, as if he hadn't slept in days. They sat in the booth by the window, close enough to watch the rain hammer against the glass, yet somehow, despite the storm, everything outside felt eerily silent. The waitress who brought them their coffee had a blank look on her face, her movements slow and mechanical. Her name tag read Emma. But when Lucy tried to make small talk, Emma's response was little more than a muttered, Jack shrugged it off, chalking it up to late-night shifts and boredom, but Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They ordered burgers, hoping that a hot meal would chase away the unease. But when Emma returned with their plates, the food looked off. The burgers were gray and cold, the lettuce wilted, and the ketchup was a strange, rusty color that didn't quite seem right. Jack bit into his burger anyway, grimacing at the strange taste, but Lucy pushed her plate away. Something in her gut told her not to eat. Not hungry? Dale's voice made her jump. He had appeared beside the booth without her noticing, his eyes boring into her, unblinking. Just not feeling too well, she murmured, trying not to look directly into his eyes. They seemed to flicker in the dim light, as though there was something dark shifting behind them. Well, you can't leave now. Not yet, Dale said, his voice a low whisper. We have rules here. Once you sit down, you finish the meal. Don't want to make anyone angry. Lucy's skin prickled with fear. She tried to smile, to laugh it off, but the way Dale stared at her, as if daring her to refuse, made her heart pound. Jack looked up, confused, but before he could say anything, Dale walked back to the counter, leaving them alone. Then Lucy noticed something else. A family sat across from them, a man, a woman, and 2 children, each staring at their untouched plates. The kids' eyes were wide and empty, faces expressionless, as if frozen in some terrible moment. When Lucy caught the woman's eye, she didn't smile or nod. She just stared, mouth hanging open slightly, her face almost waxy. Jack, Lucy whispered, gripping his arm, we need to leave. He rolled his eyes, annoyed. Come on, Luce. It's just a weird old diner. We'll eat and go. It's fine. But as he spoke, the lights flickered, and in that split-second darkness, Lucy thought she saw something behind the counter, a shadow moving where there shouldn't be anyone at all. She blinked, and when the lights came back on, Dale was watching her, a faint smile tugging at his cracked lips. Lucy couldn't take it anymore. She pulled Jack up from the booth. "We have to go. Now." Dale's voice echoed across the diner, louder this time, almost mocking. "Leaving so soon? But your meal is waiting." Jack glanced back, and his face turned pale. The family they'd seen earlier, they were gone, vanished without a trace, as though they'd never been there at all. Only their plates remained, untouched and cold. A faint red stain smeared across the table like blood. Before they could react, the lights went out entirely, plunging the diner into pitch-black darkness. Lucy's heart pounded as she fumbled for Jack's hand, but her fingers met only empty air. She called his name, but her voice seemed swallowed up by the silence, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Then a sound broke the silence, a soft shuffling like someone dragging their feet across the linoleum. It was coming closer, slow and deliberate. Lucy pressed herself against the booth, eyes straining in the dark, trying to make out any shape, any movement. When the lights flickered back on, Dale stood mere inches from her, his face inches from hers. His skin seemed to have changed, grown paler, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes, they were black, bottomless pits, and his smile had twisted into something far more sinister. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "No one finds the last stop diner unless they're lost, and no one leaves until their debt is paid." Lucy tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat as the other diners, the family, Emma, even Jack, appeared around her, their faces blank and empty, eyes wide with horror. She reached for Jack, but his skin was cold, his hand limp, his gaze vacant, as if he was no longer truly there. "No," she gasped, stumbling back, but Dale's hand clamped onto her arm, his grip like ice. "Every lost soul needs a place to rest," he murmured, guiding her back to the booth. "You're part of the diner now. Forever." The lights flickered one last time, and the world went dark. Days later, a trucker passing through the town pulled into the diner, weary and hungry. He ordered a coffee and a sandwich, barely looking up from his plate. But as he bit into his meal, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. From the corner booth, a young woman with hollow eyes and a pale, twisted smile stared at him, her hand limp in that of a vacant, glassy-eyed man beside her. In the last stop diner, they were always waiting. The Rest Easy Diner sat on the outskirts of a quiet little town, right where the highway met a stretch of dark, twisting forest. It was the last stop for miles, a lone beacon of neon light calling out to travelers passing through at odd hours. For years, people had whispered about strange occurrences there, of patrons who left but were never seen again, of strange messages scrawled on bathroom mirrors, and of faces in the windows after closing. But no one knew for sure what went on in that diner. They just knew to avoid it after dark. One night, 3 friends on a road trip, Sam, Ben, and Lily, found themselves pulling into the diner's lot, half-starved after hours of driving with no sign of civilization. It was late, nearly midnight, and the parking lot was empty, except for an old pickup truck and a single flickering light over the entrance. The place looked abandoned, the kind of establishment where the seats cracked and the air smelled faintly of grease and mildew. Inside, the diner was silent, save for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of an old jukebox that must have been left on. They seated themselves in a booth near the window, looking around at the cracked countertops and the faded wallpaper. A single waitress shuffled over, an elderly woman with stringy gray hair and hollow, sunken eyes that never quite met theirs. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice raspy, barely above a whisper. She didn't write down their orders, just stood there staring at them, hands shaking slightly as they ordered coffee, fries, and sandwiches. While they waited, Sam noticed a framed picture on the wall by the counter, a black and white photo of the diner dated 1953. In the picture, the diner looked much the same, with the same counter stools and booths, even the same chipped tile. But in the background, he could make out a group of people gathered by the window, all staring at the camera with dark, solemn expressions. "Hey guys, look at this," he said, motioning to the photo. Lily squinted at it. "Weird. Is it just me, or do those people look wrong?" They looked closer, and each felt the same strange sense of dread. The faces in the picture were blank and expressionless, eyes hollow, like they were staring right through the glass, right into the present, directly at them. Maybe it's some kind of old promotional picture, Ben suggested, but his voice was shaky. He turned back to the booth, looking out the window to distract himself. That's when he saw it. In the reflection, a group of figures stood behind them, motionless. Ben's heart skipped a beat as he whipped around, but no one was there, just the quiet, empty diner. "What's wrong?" Sam asked, noticing his pale face. "I thought I saw something," Ben stammered. "Like people, right behind us." They all exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could say anything, the waitress returned with their food. She set down the plates with a trembling hand, her gaze fixed on the table, never looking them in the eyes. "Enjoy your meal," she muttered, her voice barely audible, and then she shuffled back toward the kitchen, disappearing behind the door. Sam picked up his sandwich and took a bite, but immediately he spit it out, his face twisted in disgust. "God, this tastes awful," he muttered, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Lily sniffed her fries, her nose wrinkling. They smelled sour, like they had been left out for days. "Let's just pay and go," Lily said, glancing around. "This place is seriously creepy." But when they tried to get the waitress's attention, she was nowhere to be seen. They called out, even went up to the counter, but there was no sign of her. Then, on impulse, Sam tried the door. It wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he whispered, pulling harder. "What the hell?" Ben checked the windows, but they wouldn't open either. A sense of panic began to set in. They were alone, locked inside, with no sign of anyone else. Just then, the lights began to flicker, the diner's hum growing louder, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the room. They huddled together as the jukebox sputtered to life, playing an old song from the 50s that crackled with static. "Hello?" Lily called out, voice shaking. "Is anyone here?" Silence. But then, from the corner of her eye, Lily noticed something. The framed picture on the wall. The faces had changed. Now, instead of blank stares, the people in the photo were smiling. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a twisted, haunting grin, stretched too wide, teeth bared as though they were laughing at some private, cruel joke. "I don't like this," Lily whispered, backing away. The lights flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the floor. When they came back on, the figures from the picture were gone, and the booth by the window was filled with dark shapes, faint, ghostly outlines of people, all staring at the three friends, their grins wide and menacing. Ben felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, icy fingers digging into his skin. He gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. Only a faint outline of a hand, like a bruise where he had been touched. "Let's get out of here," Sam shouted, pulling them toward the back, desperate to find any exit. They stumbled into the kitchen, hoping for a back door, but the room was empty, except for the stench of something rotten, something that made their stomachs turn. A row of rusted pots and pans hung on the wall, and beneath them a door stood slightly ajar. They didn't hesitate. They ran for it, pushing the door open, only to find a narrow hallway with walls that seemed to stretch endlessly. They ran, breath coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how far they went, the hallway never ended. It twisted and turned, bending in impossible angles, leading them in circles. The hum of the diner grew louder, the beat faster, until it felt like it was pounding in their skulls, like the walls themselves were alive, closing in on them. Just when they thought they couldn't run anymore, they burst through a door and found themselves back in the dining area, standing in front of the same booth they'd started in. The diner was empty, save for the photograph on the wall, where 3 new faces had appeared. Young, terrified, frozen in horror. Their own faces. Ben opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He could feel his body stiffening, his skin going cold, his heart slowing. In the glass of the window, he saw his reflection staring back at him, lips twisted in the same unnatural grin as the faces in the picture. The neon sign outside flickered, and for a moment the words, "Rest Easy Diner," glowed blood red. Then the lights dimmed, leaving the diner shrouded in darkness once again. And somewhere down the highway another car approached, its passengers drawn to the light, unaware of the horrors waiting inside. The Red Moon Diner was a rundown joint on a desolate stretch of highway, sandwiched between endless fields of corn that stretched as far as the eye could see. The locals said the place was cursed. that strange things happened whenever the moon turned blood red in the sky. Most people knew to stay away, but for those passing through, the diner was a beacon, a warm light in the middle of nowhere, promising food, rest, and a break from the loneliness of the road. One autumn night, a man named Carl found himself pulling into the parking lot of the Red Moon Diner. He was an over-the-road trucker, used to late nights and weird places, and he didn't believe in superstitions. He'd been on the road for hours, his eyes heavy and stomach empty, and he just wanted a hot meal and a cup of coffee to keep him going through the night. As he stepped out of his truck, he glanced up at the sky. The moon was high and full, but tonight it glowed an eerie shade of red, casting a strange, unsettling light over the landscape. The air felt thick and still, the kind of night where even the faintest sound seemed to echo. Inside, the diner was empty. Carl looked around, noticing the red vinyl booths and the black and white checkered floor. The place was spotless, gleaming as if it had been polished to perfection, but it was silent. No hum of a jukebox, no sound of sizzling food from the kitchen. It was as if the diner itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" Carl called out, his voice echoing off the walls. A woman appeared from the kitchen, her figure silhouetted against the dim light. She was tall and thin, with a face that looked pale, almost ghostly, under the red glow filtering through the windows. Her eyes seemed to shimmer, reflecting the strange light from the moon. "Welcome," she said in a soft, almost hypnotic voice. "Take a seat. I'll get you a coffee." Carl sat at the counter, watching her as she poured the coffee. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was savoring each motion. She placed the cup in front of him with a slight smile, her eyes never leaving his. "What brings you out here tonight?" she asked, her tone friendly but with an edge that made him uneasy. "Just passing through," Carl muttered, taking a sip of the coffee. It tasted strange, bitter and metallic, but he was too tired to care. "Needed a break. Been driving all night." The woman's smile widened. "Well, you've come to the right place. We get all kinds of travelers here. All kinds." Carl nodded, trying to shake off the unease settling over him. "Is it just you working tonight?" he asked, glancing around the empty diner. The woman's smile faltered slightly. "For now," she replied. "But you're not alone. Not really." Carl chuckled nervously, not sure what she meant, but he kept drinking his coffee. As he looked out the window, he noticed something strange. Shadows moved in the cornfield, just barely visible in the red glow of the moon. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the shapes seemed to grow, twisting and merging as they moved closer to the diner. "What's that out there?" he asked, nodding toward the window. The woman followed his gaze and let out a soft, almost musical laugh. "Oh, they're just visitors. Curious, like you." Carl felt a chill run down his spine. The shadows outside seemed to stop, gathering just beyond the glass, their forms vaguely human but distorted, elongated, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. "Sometimes they get a bit restless," the woman continued, her voice barely a whisper, "especially on a night like this." Carl shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at her. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned closer, her face inches from his. He could see now that her skin was unnaturally smooth, almost waxy, and her eyes held a strange gleam, like embers in the dark. "The red moon draws them in, you see. They've been here before, and they're always hungry." Carl felt his throat tighten. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about, but I think I'll just pay and head out." He reached for his wallet, but the woman's hand shot out, cold and firm, gripping his wrist. "You can't leave now," she murmured, her voice like ice. "Not until they've had their fill." Carl pulled his hand away, backing up from the counter. "Lady, you're scaring me." Her eyes followed him, unblinking. "They get hungry when the moon turns red, you see. They've been waiting so long." Carl glanced back out the window, and his stomach dropped. The shadows had multiplied, pressing against the glass, their faces faintly visible now, eyes dark and hollow, mouths stretched open in silent screams. They stared at him, their gazes piercing, as though they could see straight into his soul. Panicking, Carl turned toward the door, but as he moved, the shadows seemed to follow, gliding along the windows, their twisted hands pressing against the glass, leaving smears that looked disturbingly like blood. He reached the door and yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold, refusing to turn. He pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but his voice seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The woman's laughter echoed through the diner, soft and mocking. "You can't leave, Carl," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "The red moon brought you here for a reason. It always brings the lost souls." Carl turned to face her, his heart pounding. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. Her face twisted into a cruel smile, her features seeming to shift, to distort. "I'm just a host, Carl, the one who brings the meal to the table." She stepped back, gesturing toward the shadows outside. "And tonight, they're starving." As the words left her lips, the shadows surged forward, slamming against the glass with a force that rattled the entire diner. Cracks spread across the windows, spiderwebbing as the figures pressed closer, their mouths gaping wider, eyes burning with unnatural hunger. Carl backed up, his eyes darting around the diner for any escape, but every door, every window was sealed shut. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening with the scent of decay and rot. The woman watched him, her smile widening, her eyes glittering with dark satisfaction. "There's only one way out, Carl," she murmured, gesturing toward the shadows clawing at the glass. In a final act of desperation, Carl grabbed a chair and hurled it at the nearest window. The glass shattered, and the shadows poured in like a flood, filling the room with an icy chill. He screamed as they swarmed over him, their hands cold as death, pulling him down, their faces inches from his, their eyes empty and soulless. As the last of the shadows consumed him, he heard the woman's voice, soft and mocking, echoing in his mind. "Thank you for visiting the Red Moon Diner," she whispered. "We hope you enjoy your stay." And as the red glow faded from the sky, the diner returned to its silent vigil, waiting patiently for the next lost soul to wander through its doors.